Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to talk to you today about introversion and extroversion, which I have come to believe are as profound a part of our identities as our gender. And that therefore it's extremely important to know where we fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum. And when I say this, I'm not talking about where do you appear to fall. Because in this extroverted culture of ours, we all tend to act a lot more extroverted than we really are, right? So I'm talking about who are you really if you could spend your time exactly as you please, your work days, your weekends. Would you be more of an introvert or would you be more of an extrovert? And we're going to try to answer this question very quickly. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just to quickly break up into groups of 6, and we're going to come together and have you all share a very private, personal, and profound experience from your childhoods that you think illuminates who you are. And then we're going to pick the most private and the most personal out of these groups and share them with the entire audience. Yeah, right, I'm just kidding. We're not really going to do that. But for the brief moment when you thought I was actually serious, how are you feeling and what were you thinking? Right, you were probably thinking, like, how do I get out of the room right now without insulting the speaker? Or I don't know, maybe there were some of you who were thinking that actually sounds like a nice chance to chat? Okay, not so much. Well, let's just take a quick show of hands. How many of you would say you are introverts? Oh my gosh, it might actually be 100%. Let me ask it the other way. Any extroverts in the room? Okay, so probably maybe 4 or 5% of you. Okay, so the real question is why? What is it that makes you an introvert? What is it that makes you an extrovert? These are terms that we kind of throw around, but I don't think that we really know what we mean by them. And it turns out that what's at the bottom of all of this is the amount of stimulation that you like. So introverts are people who prefer lower levels of stimulation, and I'm talking about social stimulation, but I'm talking about other kinds of stimulation in general. Generally speaking, there are exceptions. Introverts would prefer, less noise, more quiet, that kind of thing. Whereas extroverts really do truly crave more stimulation for them to feel at their best and to feel most energized. So this is why an introvert would generally, socially rather have a glass of wine with a close friend as opposed to go to a party full of strangers. And you'll note when I say this that I'm giving you a social example because I think there's a really problematic misconception about what introversion is. We tend to equate it to some degree with being antisocial. And it's not that, it's just a different way of being social. It's seeking a kind of quieter way of being social. But it's also, as I said, about other kinds of stimulation. And this is important to understand. So for example, the psychologist Russell Gein did a study where he had people solve math problems, introverts and extroverts, with different levels of background noise playing. And what he found was that the introverts solved the problems more quickly, more effectively when the noise was lower, when the background noise was lower. And the extroverts performed better when the background noise was higher. And this is a really important thing to understand because what it's telling us is that we kind of all have sweet spots, I like to call them, sweet spots of how much stimulation we need to feel at our best. And if we can manage to set up our lives so that we are living as much as possible within our sweet spots, both socially and acoustically and everything else, then we will tend to be at our most powerful. Now, the reason I wrote this book is because for introverts, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that because we live in a society that is organized for extroverts. The stimulation levels are all kind of set up to maximize the energies of extroverts in general, and less so for introverts. And it may be different, actually, at a company like Microsoft. So I'd love to hear from you guys when we get to the Q&A at the end. But in general, in our culture, the bias against introversion, it's so deep and it's so profound, and we internalize it from such an early age. We don't even realize that we're doing it. But it happens young, from the minute a child goes off to preschool, and they're immediately presented with a group environment that they're supposed to be plunging right into, and if they don't, they sense that they're not meeting some kind of a social norm. They know it at a very young age. And teachers have been shown to believe, the majority of teachers believe, that the ideal student is an extrovert, even though, by the way, introverted kids get better grades in general. Same thing in many workplaces, and again, I would love to hear your experiences here, but we are increasingly setting up our workplaces so that people have to be kind of interacting all day long in open plan offices. And when it comes to leadership, we find that introverts are routinely passed over for leadership positions in favor of extroverts, even though recent research by Adam Grant at the Wharton School tells us that introverted leaders often deliver better outcomes than extroverts do. They deliver better outcomes. And the reason is, by the way, that they are less, if they are managing proactive employees who are creative and kind of generating their own ideas, an introverted leader is much less likely to try to kind of put their own stamp on things. And instead, they let other people run with their ideas and let them implement them. Whereas an extroverted leader might quite unwittingly just be sort of dominant and not letting other ideas come to the fore. Now, I also want to talk to you about, kind of on a deeper and a more profound level, the way in which our society would be a better place and might literally depend, the survival and the thriving of our society might depend on having a real balance of power between introverts and extroverts. And the way I'm going to show this to you at first, I'm going to start in a kind of unlikely place, but I want to start by taking you with me to a colony of fruit flies and to the animal kingdom in general. We're going to start with fruit flies and then we're going to make our way up to humans. One of the most interesting things I learned when I was researching my book is that there are animal introverts and animal extroverts in many different species throughout the animal kingdom. I mean, like, who knew? But it's true. And when you look at fruit flies, you find that there are what biologists call sitter fruit flies, and there are rover fruit flies. And the sitter fruit flies are exactly what they sound like. They kind of tend to, sort of hop up and down in place. And the rover fruit flies are much more exploratory, and they kind of go roaming the outer margins of fruit fly society. And they do this for a reason. They do this because they have different survival strategies. Each one does better in different kinds of conditions. And I want to illustrate this by moving now a little bit further up the chain of the animal kingdom. I'm going to talk to you about pumpkin seed fish and this fascinating experiment that was done by an evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson, who he went to this pond where he found lots of pumpkin seed fish, and he dropped a gigantic trap right into the middle of the pond. An event which he says, from the fish's perspective, must have seemed, as alien as a spaceship landing in the middle of Times Square. And what happened? What he found was that the more introverted fish sort of hovered judiciously on the sidelines of the pond and didn't get anywhere near the trap that David Sloan Wilson had put in. And the more extroverted fish, the rover fish, they were like, what's that thing in the middle of the pond? I've got to go check it out. And they went swimming right up to it, and they were immediately trapped. And so, had that trap been an actual predator, in that scenario, it was the extroverted fish who would have perished and the introverted fish who would have survived. But now here's the flip side. A few days later, David Sloan Wilson comes back, and this time he has fishing nets. And he manages to scoop up the introverted fish as well. And he carries them back to his lab where the extroverted fish are already waiting for them. And he tracks what happens once they're back in their lab. And he finds that in that situation, an alien condition, the extroverted fish adapt much more quickly. And they start eating more quickly, and they start roaming around and exploring, and they're comfortable, which is, of course, exactly the behavior that we see with human extroverts, right? They're just sort of immediately more comfortable in a new surrounding. And so in that kind of a situation, it's much better to be an extrovert. And I tell you all this at great length because you will start to see that this has parallels throughout the human condition as well. And so now let me talk to you about humans, about sitters and rovers, about introverts and extroverts. And I want to start by talking to you about children, because children are incredibly important, because whether or not you have children of your own, the thing about kids is that they haven't yet learned to act in ways that are foreign to their true natures. And so the way they act actually tells us a lot about who we really are. So let me ask you, how many of you have kids? Okay, a lot of you. And how many of you have ever been to a kind of, mommy and me or daddy and me type of class, like a music class where you all sit around? Okay. So for those of you who haven't been, I'm going to show you a picture. This is what this kind of a class looks like. So it's a bunch of parents and babysitters sitting in a circle with the kids, and their job is to be there singing songs and playing musical instruments. And what you find when you go to a class like this, you find that half of the kids, roughly, are behaving like sitters, meaning that they are cleaving to their parents' laps. They're not going to explore. They're watching from the sidelines. And then the other half are just exploring as if there's nothing in their way. Like that little kid, you see that baby in the red jumpsuit? He's right there in the middle of the room. He has no idea where his mom is, and it's okay with him. Now, the thing about these kinds of classes is, I know from years of interviewing parents, that the parents of the sitter children tend to get really worried about their children, because they feel like, oh my gosh, this mommy and me class is just, it's symbolic of what's going to become of my child for the rest of his or her life. They're going to sit on the sidelines, they're not going to participate, no one's going to know who they are, they're not going to get the best that this world has to offer. And they really worry. So let's track the development of these two kinds of children to see whether this worry is warranted. Now, the rover children, I think we already kind of know what their development is. They tend to be very bold, very exploratory. These are kids who will make friends very easily. When they grow older, it'll be easier for them to strike up new business deals. It's you kind of know the picture. The children who are more on the sidelines, here's the important thing to understand about them. It seems as if they're just sitting there kind of passively and inertly, but that's not actually what's happening. These children are doing what psychologists call paying alert attention to things. They're paying alert attention. And so very often, they will ultimately plunge into whatever the social scenario is, and sometimes it takes them minutes, and sometimes it's days or weeks or months, but they will plunge in eventually, and when they do, they understand the rules of the game, and they usually understand it with a kind of subtlety that is born of this kind of close attention. And so the thing about these children is that they're noticing scary things, but they're also noticing more things in general. And I'm just going to give you an example of how this plays out cognitively and intellectually, because these children really do have a different intellectual way of interacting with the world. If you give these kinds of kids this type of a game, which is two pictures that look very similar, and the job is to just spot the subtle differences between them, these children will spend more time figuring out the difference between the two pictures, and they will more often get the right answer. And this is true all the way into adulthood. Once these children grow up, if you give them problems to solve, they will spend more time at the problems, and they will more often get the right answer. And one example of this is somebody like an Einstein, who famously said that it's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stick with problems longer. And this really is a very effective style. And so introverts, as I said before, they've been shown to get better grades. They more often have Phi Beta Kappa keys. They do well intellectually in general. And the other thing about them, and I'm sorry, extroverts, but introverts actually know more about, they know more about many subjects than extroverts do. There was one really interesting study where they tested college freshmen in 21 different subjects, ranging from art to astronomy to physics to statistics. And the introverts knew more than the extroverts about every single one of the subjects. And what's important about this is that it's not that the introverts were more intelligent, because as a group, the introverts and extroverts are equal when it comes to IQ scores. So it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's rather that the very behavioral style that our culture excoriates in introverts is actually a boon when it comes time to sitting down and solving problems and strategizing and thinking things through.